Sarah stood in the middle of the most expensive ballroom in New York, holding a wedding dress that cost more than her life. She had spent 6 months planning every detail of this wedding for her boss, the cold and heartless billionaire Julian Vane. She had picked the flowers he liked, the music he preferred, and even the ring for a mystery bride she had never met. As the doors opened for the final rehearsal, Julian didn't bring in a supermodel or a socialite. He walked up to Sarah, took the dress from her trembling hands and said, "Put it on. The guests are arriving in an hour, and I'm not marrying anyone but the woman who already knows my soul." Sarah realized in that heartbeat that she hadn't been his employee. She had been his target. Sarah worked 16 hours a day for Julian Vane. He was a man who controlled the stock market with a single phone call, but he couldn't seem to manage his own personal life. Sarah was the one who bought his coffee, scheduled his haircuts, and made sure his dry cleaning was perfect. She lived in a tiny apartment and wore sensible shoes while Julian lived in a penthouse made of glass and steel. She was invisible to him, or so she thought, just another gear in his massive corporate machine. One Monday morning, Julian called her into his office and dropped a bombshell. He told her he was getting married in 6 months to settle a family legacy requirement. He didn't tell her who the woman was, only that the wedding had to be the most spectacular event in the history of the city. He handed her a black credit card with no limit and told her she was in charge of every single detail. Sarah felt a sharp pain in her chest that she couldn't explain, but she nodded and took the card. She started by scouting locations. Julian rejected every 5-star hotel she suggested. He told her he wanted something private, something that felt like a sanctuary. He finally settled on an estate in the countryside that he had purchased in secret. Sarah spent her weekends driving back and forth, overseeing the renovations. She found herself picking colors and fabrics that she personally loved, thinking she was just matching Julian's sophisticated taste. Julian was surprisingly involved in the process. He didn't care about the guest list, which he told Sarah to keep to a minimum, but he cared about the food. He took Sarah to dozens of tastings, sitting across from her in candlelit corners of expensive restaurants. He watched her closely as she tried the lobster and the chocolate truffles. He told the chefs to only use the ingredients that made Sarah smile. She thought he was just being a perfectionist for his future wife. The tension began to grow when it came time to pick the music. Sarah suggested a classical orchestra, but Julian insisted on a specific jazz band that played a song Sarah had once mentioned was her favorite. He made her dance with him in the empty ballroom of the estate to test the floor. For 3 minutes the world disappeared. His hand was steady on her waist, and he looked at her with an intensity that made her breath hitch. Then the song ended and he went back to his phone. Sarah asked him several times when she would meet the bride. She needed to know the woman's measurements for the dress and her preferences for the bouquet. Julian always had an excuse. He said the bride was traveling or that she was very shy and trusted his judgment completely. Sarah felt a growing sense of resentment toward this mystery woman. She felt like she was building a dream house for someone who didn't even care enough to show up for the foundation. By the end of the first month, Sarah was exhausted and emotionally drained. She stayed late at the office to finish the floral arrangements on paper. Julian walked in and saw her asleep at her desk. He didn't wake her up. He took off his expensive suit jacket and draped it over her shoulders. He sat on the edge of her desk and watched her sleep for a long time. He whispered a promise to the quiet room that he would never let her go back to being invisible again. The second month focused on the wardrobe. Julian told Sarah that the bride was exactly her size and height. He asked Sarah to be the fit model for the entire bridal party. Sarah spent hours standing on a pedestal while world-class tailors pinned expensive lace to her body. It was a cruel kind of torture. She had to look at herself in the mirror wearing the most beautiful wedding gowns in the world, knowing they were meant for someone else. Julian attended every fitting. He sat in a velvet chair with a glass of scotch, watching Sarah emerge from the dressing room in white silk after white silk. He was looking for a specific reaction. When she finally put on a gown with a long train and delicate embroidery, she started to cry. It was the dress she had dreamed of since she was a little girl. Julian stood up, walked over to her, and wiped a tear away with his thumb. He told the tailor that the search was over. The mystery of the bride started to cause rumors in the office. People noticed Julian and Sarah were always together. They saw the way he looked at her when she wasn't looking. Julian's rivals started to think that Sarah was his secret weakness. A man named Mr. Henderson, who wanted to take over Julian's company, began following Sarah. He thought if he could find out who the real bride was, he could use the information to humiliate Julian or blackmail him. Sarah felt like she was being watched. One night, a black car followed her home. She called Julian, trembling with fear. He was at her apartment in 10 minutes. He didn't just check the halls. He stayed on her sofa all night to make sure she was safe. He told her that he had many enemies and that his wedding was making them desperate. Sarah asked him why he would put his bride in such danger. Julian looked her in the eyes and said his bride was the only thing he would ever die for. The next day, Julian moved Sarah into a high-security suite in his own building. He said it was for her protection while the wedding planning continued. Sarah felt more like a prisoner than an assistant. She spent her days looking at guest lists that only had names of Julian's closest friends and family. There was no mention of a bride's family. Sarah assumed the woman was an orphan or perhaps from a family Julian didn't approve of. Despite the fear, there were moments of pure joy. Julian took Sarah to a private island to select the honeymoon destination. They walked on the beach, and for a few hours they weren't boss and employee. They talked about their childhoods and their fears. Julian admitted he had been a lonely child who used money as a shield. Sarah told him about her parents' happy but poor marriage. Julian listened to every word like it was a sacred text. At the end of the trip, Sarah found a small box on her pillow. Inside was a diamond necklace that matched the wedding dress she had fitted. There was a note that said, "For all your hard work." Sarah wanted to throw the necklace into the ocean. She was falling in love with a man who was weeks away from marrying someone else. She realized she couldn't finish the job. She decided she would quit as soon as they returned to the city. When they landed back in New York, Sarah tried to hand in her resignation. Julian refused to even look at the paper. He told her that he needed her now more than ever. He revealed that Mr. Henderson had filed a lawsuit to stop the wedding, claiming Julian was using it to hide illegal offshore accounts. Julian needed Sarah to help him organize the financial records to prove his innocence. She stayed because she couldn't bear to see him ruined, even if it meant her heart would break. They worked side by side in a secure bunker underneath Julian's mansion. The pressure was immense. Sarah discovered that Henderson was the one who was actually committing the crimes. He was trying to frame Julian to take over the Vane empire. Sarah spent 48 hours straight connecting the dots and finding the proof. When she finally finished, she collapsed from exhaustion. Julian caught her before she hit the floor and carried her to a bed in the guest quarters. While Sarah slept, Julian called his security team. He told them that the trap was set. He wasn't just planning a wedding. He was planning a takedown. He had used the wedding as a distraction to make Henderson overplay his hand. But the cost was high. Henderson was now desperate and dangerous. He knew Sarah was the one who had found the evidence. He sent his men to the mansion to snatch her before Julian could take the proof to the authorities. Sarah woke up to the sound of breaking glass. The mansion's alarms were screaming. She tried to find Julian, but the hallway was filled with smoke. A man grabbed her from behind and put a cloth over her mouth. She fought back, using the self-defense moves Julian had insisted she learn months ago. She managed to break free and ran toward Julian's office. She found him holding a heavy iron fire poker, standing over two unconscious men. Julian grabbed Sarah and pulled her into a secret passage behind a bookshelf. He told her the police were on their way, but they had to get the evidence out of the house. They ran through the dark tunnels under the estate. Sarah was terrified, but Julian's hand never let go of hers. He told her he would never let anything happen to her. They emerged in a wooded area a mile away where a helicopter was waiting. They flew to a private compound in the mountains. As the sun rose, Julian handed the evidence to the district attorney over a secure video link. Henderson was arrested within the hour. The danger was over, but Sarah was a mess. She realized that Julian had put her in the line of fire. She felt like he had used her as a pawn in his corporate war. She screamed at him, calling him a monster who only cared about his company and his secret wedding. Julian let her scream. When she was finished, he sat her down and gave her a glass of water. He told her that he never wanted her to be in danger, but he knew she was the only person smart enough to find the truth. He said he had kept her close not because she was a pawn, but because she was the only person he trusted with his life. Sarah was confused. She asked him again about the bride. Julian simply said, "The bride is the most important part of the plan, and she is already exactly where she needs to be." The week of the wedding arrived. The estate was finished, and it looked like a dream from a storybook. Thousands of white roses covered the walls, and the air smelled of jasmine and expensive champagne. Sarah felt like a ghost walking through the halls. She had finished every task. The rings were in the safe, the cake was being prepared, and the guests were starting to fly in from around the world. She decided she would leave the morning of the ceremony. Julian asked her for one last favor. He wanted to do a full rehearsal of the ceremony with the music and the lighting. He said the bride was still feeling overwhelmed and wanted Sarah to stand in for her one more time. Sarah wanted to say no, but she wanted one last moment with him in the light. She agreed to put on the dress, the veil, and the diamond necklace. She walked down the long aisle toward the altar where Julian was waiting. The music started, the jazz song they had danced to in the empty ballroom. Sarah walked slowly, her heart heavy with every step. When she reached the altar, Julian took her hands. He didn't look at a mystery woman in the back of the room. He looked at Sarah. He began to recite his vows. They weren't generic words. They were a list of all the things he loved about her. The way she took her coffee, her bravery during the break-in, and the way she challenged him when no one else would. Sarah stopped him, her voice trembling. She told him this was cruel, and that he shouldn't say those things to her when he was about to marry someone else. She tried to pull her hands away, but he held on tight. He told her there was no other woman. There had never been a socialite or a model. He had spent 6 months letting her plan her own wedding because he wanted her to have everything she ever dreamed of. He told her he had loved her since the first day she walked into his office. Sarah was stunned. She looked around the empty chapel and realized that all the choices she had made, the flowers, the food, the location, were for her. Julian had known that if he had asked her to marry him 6 months ago, she would have said no because she didn't think she belonged in his world. He had used the wedding planning to show her that she was already the center of his world. He had let her build her own fairy tale so she would know she deserved it. But the moment was interrupted by a phone call. Julian's lawyer informed him that Henderson had escaped custody during a transport and was missing. Julian's face turned pale. He realized the danger wasn't over. Henderson knew about the wedding, and he knew it was the one place Julian would be vulnerable. Julian immediately called off the rehearsal and ordered a total lockdown of the estate. He told Sarah they had to leave for the airport immediately. Sarah refused to run. She told Julian that she had spent her life being afraid and being invisible. She had just found out that she was the woman of her dreams, and she wasn't going to let a criminal take that away from her. She told Julian to call his security team and set a trap at the wedding. She wanted to face the monster in her white dress. Julian looked at his assistant and saw a queen. He nodded and began to prepare for a fight instead of a flight. The morning of the wedding was bright and clear. The estate was crawling with undercover security disguised as waiters and guests. Sarah was in the bridal suite, getting her hair done by the best stylists in the world. She was terrified, but she felt a strange sense of peace. She knew that Julian was outside, guarding the perimeter. She looked at herself in the mirror and finally saw the woman Julian saw, a person who was strong, beautiful, and loved. The ceremony began. The guests took their seats, unaware that half of them were carrying concealed weapons. Sarah walked down the aisle again, but this time the pews were full of people. Julian stood at the altar, looking more nervous than he ever had in a boardroom. As Sarah reached the halfway point, a man stood up in the back row. It was Henderson, disguised in a tuxedo and a fake beard. He pulled a small pistol from his jacket. Before Henderson could fire, Julian lunged from the altar. At the same time, the caterers tackled Henderson to the ground. The guests screamed and ducked, but the security team had the situation under control in seconds. Henderson was dragged away in handcuffs, screaming that Julian would never be happy. Julian didn't even watch him leave. He ran to Sarah, who was standing perfectly still in the middle of the aisle. He checked her for injuries, his hands shaking. Sarah smiled at him, reached out, and straightened his tie. She told him that he was late for his own wedding. The crowd, realizing the danger had passed and seeing the love between the two, began to cheer. The priest, who had been hiding behind the pulpit, stood up and asked if they should continue. Julian looked at Sarah, and she nodded. They walked the rest of the way to the altar together, hand in hand. The ceremony was short but beautiful. When the priest pronounced them husband and wife, Julian didn't just give her a polite kiss. He picked her up and spun her around while the jazz band played their song at full volume. The reception was a blur of dancing and laughter. Sarah's parents were there, having been flown in by Julian as a surprise. They told Sarah they had known about the plan for months and were so proud of the woman she had become. As the sun set, Julian took Sarah to the balcony of the estate. He looked out at the land he had bought for her. He told her that from now on, she was no longer his assistant. She was his partner in everything. He gave her a new black credit card, but this one had her new name on it, Sarah Vane. He told her she could go anywhere in the world for their honeymoon, as long as he was by her side. The story ends with Julian and Sarah walking toward a waiting helicopter, her long white train fluttering in the wind. The world was still full of business deals and rivals, but they didn't care. They had built a fortress out of love and honesty. As the helicopter lifted off, Sarah looked down at the estate she had planned and realized that the best part of the wedding wasn't the flowers or the dress. It was the man who had seen her when she was invisible.